From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Barbara Moreland. I'm with the Humanities and Social Sciences Division here at the Library of Congress. And we are most happy to have David Stewart with us today. This talk today follows, I don't know how many, over how many years that the division has sponsored. And it's one way that we help to share the work that researchers do here. But it also is important for us to be reminded, those of us who work here, that this place really is about the researchers. We have wonderful collections here at the Library of Congress, and they are available to almost anyone who wants to come here. You do need to be 16 years of age to get your reader card. However, you don't need to have other types of credentials that say that you are working on a PhD or that you have a multi-million-dollar contract with a publishing company. None of that's necessary, just a curious mind. And when you come here, when researchers come here and use these collections, then they are made available to a wider public. So that's why, for us, it's very much about the researchers and those who come and use the collections. We appreciate them. And then, again, to you for coming to share in this event today. I would like to say thank you. Abby Yokelson of the reference staff in the main reading room in Humanities and Social Sciences Division will provide our introduction.
I think for some of you here, Mr. Stewart, David O. Stewart, is a familiar face. He gave a talk. Emily Howie, my colleague, arranged a book talk back in 2009 when his book Impeached, The Trial of President Andrew Johnson, The Fight for Lincoln's Legacy, was published. He also has appeared at the 2012 National Book Festival, and you can catch that cybercast. He was speaking then about his book, American Emperor, Aaron Burr's Challenge to Jefferson's America. Or you might have seen him on C-SPAN Book TV, CNN, Hardball, and a variety of other television programs. I somehow still couldn't put the face together with the name until I saw his picture on a book jacket, and then it was like, oh yeah, that guy, he's in the main reading room all the time doing research. And I suspect colleagues in the manuscript division and elsewhere around the library would say the same thing. Oh, he's always here. Mr. Stewart practiced law for many years, including arguments before the Supreme Court and an impeachment trial in the Senate. And then he began to write history, coming around here a lot to do the research. His first book was the summer of 1787, The Men Who Invented the Constitution. That came out in 2007 and was a Washington Post bestseller and won the Washington Writing Award in that year. His books on Andrew Johnson and Aaron Burr followed, like year after year, and to the same kind of acclaim, he was awarded the prestigious Cincinnati History Prize by the Society of the Cincinnati in 2013. And anyone who's a historian or vaguely interested in history will recognize the importance of that society. But you start to get reviews that say things like a skilled historian and a splendid storyteller, or Stewart's graceful style and storytelling ability make for a good read. And someone who gets reviews that one after another says what a good storyteller he is should clearly turn to historical fiction and writing novels, making use of that storytelling. Speaking about his nonfiction works, Mr. Stewart said, I write about episodes in our history that I need to make sense of, episodes that are not well understood and also are centrally important to America's development as a nation. It doesn't get much more centrally important to our nation's development than Lincoln's assassination. That is a critical moment in our history. In the Lincoln deception, it's 1900. So decades after the actual assassination, and a whole lot of the people the key people are dead. He mixes fictional characters and real life people and introduces a rather unlikely buddy pair who are very, very effective. As I was reading it, I was casting the movie in my mind of who would play this buddy pair. And the book explores whether there was a deeper, unrevealed conspiracy behind the well-known John Wilkes Booth conspiracy. And just in case Mr. Stewart didn't have enough to do producing these acclaimed books year after year, he also is the founder and president of the Washington Independent Review of Books. It's an online book review site, but truly it's a community of writers who are brought together here in Washington and contribute to that site. I thought Barbara was going to mention, but she didn't. This is being filmed, and so there'll be a question and answer session afterwards. So if you decide to ask a question, please be aware that you could be captured for posterity on our cybercast. Also, if you have any phones, go ahead and turn those off too. Thank you very much.
Took my notes.
Bad thing.
Could be a short talk. Thank you all for coming out, and it's a great privilege to be here. I am a huge fan of the library, and I know many of the librarians by sight more than by name, and I like to think of myself as a power user, and I thought yesterday was a pretty good capsule. I came and I hung out for a few minutes in my little hidey hole over in the Adams building, and then went to the manuscript room, which of course you have to really look for these days. And they had all their readers being used, the microfilm readers, so they had to take me up to the newspaper room to do that. And then I ended up in prints and photographs as well as the law libraries. So I was in 4 of the rooms. So I feel good about that. This book is a departure for me, and it was a hoot. It was a lot of fun to do. It did grow out of research for my second book on the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. And it is very much a work of fiction. But I tried to apply the rule of historical fiction, which I think is very important, which is you don't mess with what we know. It's tough enough on readers sorting fact from fiction. So if you want to write historical fiction, you have an obligation to go find out what we do know. Those of us who write history, and I'm honored to see Adam Goodhart, a great history writer here today, know that most of history is silence. Most of what's out there that happened, we don't know. So there's plenty of room to make up stuff. And the things we do know, which are really usually just things that are written down or somebody thought to write down or made a picture of, we need to take care about. And I love the adage that I apply for that, which is you can make up a lot, but Lincoln has to be tall. So I tried to follow that rule here. Let's see if I can make this not too painful. Oh, this is disappointing. There we go. Soon. The story starts with this fellow, John Bingham. He was a Republican congressman from eastern Ohio, town of Cadiz. He was strongly anti-slavery, a real leading figure in the House of Representatives of his time. He was a leader in the impeachment effort, which is why I was researching him. And was also the author of the 14th Amendment, the first section of which guarantees us due process of law and equal protection laws, really the second Constitution. And we have a lot to be thankful to John Bingham about. But there's another major role he played in history, which was he was the lead trial prosecutor of the Booth co-conspirators, who were tried in the summer of 1865. When he tried that case, the trial lasted about 2 months. His theory was that Jefferson Davis had ordered and was the mastermind behind the prosecution, behind the assassination. That theory was somewhat undermined. He produced several witnesses who testified that they heard Confederate officers talk about how Booth was going to be in charge of the getting rid of Lincoln, and that they saw documents that indicated this, and it all led back to Jefferson Davis. Unfortunately, a few months after the trial, two of these witnesses were revealed to be sort of chronic and lifelong perjurers, one of whom was sort of almost of legendary quality. His name was Sanford Conover, or Charles Dunham. He went by a bunch of different names, was a serious flim-flam artist. And so this theory, which, you know, at the end of the war, pretty much everybody assumed the South had arranged to have Lincoln assassinated, the theory started to fall into disrepute. When I was researching the impeachment book, I came upon a very obscure biography of Bingham. There's a new one out just this year, but before that, the last one was about 40 years ago. I got it at the main reading room. He brought it out. It was printed in sort of photo offset type. I think there are people here old enough to remember that. It couldn't have had a circulation of more than a few hundred. I'm quite sure I was the only person to read that book for several decades. And it was done by a scholar out in Ohio who, God bless him, sourced everything he found. And he has one paragraph in that book that stuck in my head. And he tells the story of John Bingham on his deathbed. And on his deathbed, Bingham described the conversation he had during the trial with Mary Surratt. I'll talk more about Mary Surratt. She was one of the Booth co-conspirators. She was the first woman ever executed by the United States government. And Bingham said, and this is in 1900, he's 85 years old, he said, "Mrs. Surratt told me a terrible secret. And I told only one other person, was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's rock during the Civil War. And Stanton and I agreed that no one could be told, that if the secret got out, it would destroy the Republic. So Stanton took the secret to his grave, and now the secret dies with me." Whereupon he died, without ever revealing the secret. Now, this stuck in my head for a couple of years. What was the secret? Was there more to the conspiracy than the generally accepted view? At this point in our history, you know, we're still working on Kennedy conspiracy theories, but the Lincoln conspiracy theories have somewhat died out. And this notion that Booth was the lone mastermind is really the dominant narrative we get. And then, of course, there were the practical questions. How do I reinvestigate this case 150 years later? Or even if I have the story pick up in 1900, when Bingham finally reveals that there is a secret, he doesn't tell what it is, how do you reinvestigate it in 1900, 35 years later? So, given my predilection for history, that's where I turned to start trying to think through some of these problems. I knew I couldn't write a nonfiction book, so I was thinking about a fiction book, and I wanted to think about assassinations. Of course, there's the Lincoln assassination. We've had three others. James Garfield. I almost always get right up to the edge of saying John Garfield, but that's a different guy. William McKinley in 1901, and then, of course, Kennedy, and we are just emerging from the tunnel of Kennedy anniversary events. Let's look at the assassins who are involved. This is Charles Guiteau, who killed Garfield. Leon Czolgosz, the anarchist who killed McKinley. And of course, Lee Harvey Oswald, familiar to a lot of us. And it's useful to sort of take them in for a second. These are people who were leaving a pretty light footprint in the sands of time in their lives, not successful people. And they sort of frame what we expect from an assassin, that it will be sort of a lone wolf, a loser, somebody with a grudge. And that's what we have sort of in our synapses as the expected picture of an assassin. Well, let's contrast it with John Wilkes Booth. There's an immediate distinction between the two. Booth is a lot better looking. But there's a more important distinction. He was far from nobody. Booth was the scion of the most prominent theatrical family in the country. His father, Junius Booth, had been a great star of the stage, traveled all across the country. His brother, Edwin Booth, and his other brother, Junius, were also renowned actors. His brother Edwin more than John Wilkes, and John Wilkes took his turn on the stage. He was known more for his athleticism than for his brilliant reading of Shakespeare, but he was a headliner who performed all across the country. Indeed, he probably couldn't have walked down a street in a major city in the United States in 1865 without having somebody recognize him. So this is a very different image. This is a celebrity assassin. Before turning from Booth, I always have to show this image, which I love. Booth actually did not perform on the stage for the 11 months before the assassination, except for one performance in November of 1864, which he did as a benefit in New York with his brothers. And they did Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And to show how life does not imitate art, in this performance, Booth portrayed the loyal one, Mark Antony, and his brothers played the assassins, Brutus and Cassius. And I point out, Booth is on the far left. John Wilkes Booth is on the far left. He shaved his mustache for the role. Now, there were 8 co-conspirators with Booth. This is an image I love to show from Harper's Weekly because it reflects a bit the national obsession that we had with Mary Surratt. You'll note that she is the central figure in the conspiracy here, and Booth is relegated to sort of an orbiting position about her. Not particularly accurate historically, but it does reflect the sort of public fascination with having a female who was engaged in an assassination conspiracy. And she's a very interesting character. She was an educated woman. She had attended a secondary school in Alexandria, Virginia, married a man named John Surratt in southern Maryland, southern Prince George's County. He began as a farmer, but they ended up opening this tavern at a crossroads. It was called Surrattsville because the post office was located there, and that was the postal address. I figured, why not give his name to the postal address? Since the assassination, they changed the name of the town to Clinton, thinking Surrattsville was a little incendiary and not foreseeing that Clinton would become a controversial name of its own. Her husband became a drunkard, sort of went into decline. Mary really took over the businesses, and it was a business, you think of it a bit like a roadside inn and convenience store. They had tavern, inn. They also had a smithy. They had a carriage shop for repairing your carriage. In 1862, the husband dies and Mary takes over the business for real. And at that point, the family is very much dedicated to the Confederate cause. Now, this is not unusual in southern Maryland. It was a very much Confederate-leaning area, culturally, socially, economically. It was tobacco country, heavy slave-owning country, and this was the orientation of her neighbors. The older son, Isaac, was a volunteer in the Confederate Army. He fought in Texas. And the younger son, John Harrison Surratt Jr., became a spy and a courier. This is John Surratt Jr. He's a bit of a dandy, a nice-looking young fellow, and he was known to favor fine clothes. Keep that in your mind. I will be circling back to that. at a very early age, 18 and 19, he became a Confederate courier, was a gifted one, a real daredevil. He hid his messages in his boot and in loose boards in the buggies that he was driving. He was contemptuous of the detectives who were sent to stop him. They stopped him and couldn't find the messages often. And he made rather a name for himself. The Confederates from Richmond liked to send their messages through southern Maryland, across the Potomac River into southern Maryland, where they had a very simple system for getting them to their agents in the rest of the country, because so many of the postmasters were Confederate leaning. They'd just get them delivered to the postmasters, and the postmasters would put them in the mail, and the U.S. Postal Service would then deliver these secret messages. In late 1864, John Surratt sets up, well, he is part of a terribly important meeting with John Wilkes Booth in Washington, which is the beginning of the conspiracy. And the meeting is set up by a neighbor of his, a fellow named Samuel Mudd, Dr. Mudd, somewhat notorious as well. He will end up standing trial with the other conspirators. And Dr. Mudd was engaged with the Confederate Secret Service to some extent, as many of the people were in that part of the area, and that part of the state. And he put them together for a meeting. Booth and Surratt hit it off famously and began scheming. Now, at just about that time, the Surratt family picks up from Surrattsville and moves to Washington. They move to this townhouse, which was owned by the Surratt family, and it's still standing. It is now an Asian fusion restaurant, Wok and Roll, and it's on 8th Street between 6th and 7th. I desperately wanted to have my book party there, but I could never find anybody I could negotiate with in my language. The exterior of the building is really quite as it was then. Obviously, the interior has been changed a good deal to accommodate a restaurant and a dim sum table, but that became the physical and emotional center of the conspiracy against Abraham Lincoln. Booth and John Surratt developed a plan to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, whisk him down to Richmond, and hold him for ransom. What they would get in return for Lincoln is never entirely clear. The predominant story is that they want to get a lot of the Confederate prisoners of war released, so then we'll have a new influx of soldiers who can carry on the battle. There's some suggestion occasionally that they might even, get a victorious peace out of such a bargain. So Surratt began recruiting people to help with this. Lewis Powell, I clerked for Lewis Powell at the Supreme Court, so I really hate that this man's name was Lewis Powell. So he went by the name Lewis Payne, so that's how I refer to him. He was a Confederate veteran, a large man, very powerful. You can tell that the photographer sort of fell in love with him. There's a whole series of pictures of him taken after he was captured, and they really could be a layout for GQ. They're quite remarkable. He was recruited for the muscle. Lincoln was a large, powerful man. To subdue Lincoln was not going to be so easy. George Atzerodt, whose photographs are not a candidate for GQ, was a German immigrant and a waterman. He handled boats on the Potomac, and he was to pilot the boat across the river with the president in it. David Herold was a sort of outdoorsman in southern Maryland, a guy who knew all the hidden highways and byways, and he was going to help them evade capture and pursuit. And they all became habitués of the Surratt house in the months before the assassination. A couple might have stayed there for a night or two. They didn't actually move in, but they often came by for meetings and conversations or to see Surratt. And interestingly enough, John Wilkes Booth became quite a habitué of the Surratt house. And on numerous occasions, he came simply to see Mary. Now, Booth was a dashing 26-year-old matinee idol, and Mary was a 42-year-old lady with three grown children, who was invariably referred to in the press as stout. We do not know what their relationship was. Could have been anything, to be honest, but we do know that he valued her company. She was an intelligent woman, and he spent hours with her. It's sort of an interesting piece of the story. She doesn't look that heavy in this picture, so I'm always a little puzzled by that. They put that team together with a couple of Booth's old school friends, men from Baltimore, Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin, and the goal was to waylay Lincoln on his way to a performance. This developed in mid-March of 1865. Lincoln was supposed to go to a performance for injured soldiers at Campbell Hospital. This is an image of Campbell Hospital at the time. I was really quite stunned when I discovered that Campbell Hospital, which, I mean, it sounds like Lincoln is going off into the boondocks, is at the current location of Florida Avenue between 5th and 7th Streets. So the woods were not far from downtown Washington in those days. They staked out a deserted part of the road on the way there, which is, near as I can tell, not much more than a mile from the Surratt house, and waited for him. Lincoln changed his plans. He did not go, and in his stead, Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase went to the performance. The conspirators seem to have concluded that nobody would ransom anything for Salmon P. Chase, so they let him go by. They then retired to the Surratt house with guns and knives falling out of their pockets, and angrily had a variety of recriminations with each other, and then went off. Between that point, which is March 17th, and a month later, when the assassination happens, which is April 14th, the plan evolves, and we don't have a good handle on how it evolved. We do know, of course, that Booth did lay in wait for Lincoln, or break into his booth at the Ford's Theater and shoot him, deliver a mortal blow. What's often forgotten, though, is that there was an assassin who was waiting for Andrew Johnson, the new vice president. Johnson had only been vice president for 5 weeks. We didn't have a vice presidential residence at the time, did not for another 100 years thereafter. So Johnson, who had just arrived from Tennessee, was staying at the Kirkwood House Hotel. Surratt, who was the waterman, had been converted into the assassin. He went to the Kirkwood House, had an attack of nerves, stepped into the bar to fortify his nerve, knocked back a couple of shots, which had the effect of only enhancing his nerves, and he took off. And he was ultimately arrested either in Germantown or Gaithersburg. I have trouble telling them apart. My wife is on the Montgomery County Council, and she'd have my head for being confused about that. So there was no attack on Johnson, although it was intended. William Henry Seward, Secretary of State, was in a terrible condition on April 14th. He had been in a carriage accident about 10 days before. He'd broken his jaw, dislocated his shoulder. He was laying up in bed, attended by his children and his male nurse. Lewis Payne, I promised to call him, broke in. He came in under a false pretenses, claimed he was delivering medicine, but then broke past the man at the door, went upstairs to Seward's room, had pulled out a gun, tried to shoot Seward, but the gun misfired. He then pulled out a long, wicked knife and went to work with that. He slashed Seward in the face, in the arm. The male nurse tried to intervene. He got stabbed a couple of times. The two sons made an effort. They were both sort of pounded over the head with the gun. One had a fractured skull. Finally, Payne slunk off into the night, managed not to kill anyone, which was fairly remarkable. Seward did ultimately recover from his wounds, although his face was so damaged that he never allowed himself to be photographed from that side of the face for the rest of his life. But that was the third attack. And then it's often forgotten that there was a fourth intended attack. General Grant had just taken Lee's surrender 5 days before. He was supposed to go to the theater with Lincoln that night. His wife prevailed upon him not to, and talked him into going to the beach instead. He was supposed to go up to New Jersey where their children were waiting. It had been a long war. It had not had much family time, and I think the general was happy to leave. In her memoirs, Mrs. Grant describes 3 separate encounters in the 24 hours surrounding the assassination of Lincoln, during which she was quite sure that they were either being stalked or there was an attempt actually on the train to New Jersey to try to break into their compartment by men who meant to kill her husband. So when you look at that, this is a very different picture from the Garfield, McKinley, or Kennedy assassinations. This is not a lone gunman. This is not an attempt to kill the president. This is, one way to describe it might be a coup d'etat. This is an attempt to decapitate the Union government. Now, Booth was on the run for 11 days after the assassination, and then was killed in a barn. He was trapped in a barn. They set the barn on fire, and then he was shot while he was in the barn, died of his wound. 4 of the co-conspirators were hanged. Well, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. We had this trial. This is a trial before a military commission. A commission rather like we're using in Guantanamo. There were 9 military officers, and this image shows also the 2 prosecutors. And if you have a good visual memory, you may notice John Bingham is the third from the right. As a longtime defense lawyer, there's always something terrifying about seeing the judges hang out with the prosecutors, but this is something that happens. The commission was used on the theory that we were still at war in the summer of 1865. In fact, there were Confederate soldiers in the field until into the summer. And 4 of the conspirators, Mary Surratt, David Harold, Surratt, and Lewis Payne, were hanged. This is an image of their hanging. It was very important to the government to get this news out, that justice had been done. The hanging was at Fort McNair. If you go down to our ballpark, it's just a couple of blocks to the west. And the scaffold was actually in the back of where the tennis courts are, if you want to stand at the gate and look at it. 4 other co-conspirators were convicted of helping Booth. Arnold and OLaughlin, poor old Arnold and OLaughlin were the Baltimore guys. Poor old Edmund Spangler, he's the one I have some sympathy for. He was a stagehand at Ford's Theater who held Booth's horse while Booth went in and shot the president. There is no evidence of any other connection he had to this horrible event. And of course, Dr. Mudd. And Dr. Mudd's family has spent generations trying to clear his name without success. These 4 people were all sentenced to life in prison. They were imprisoned on Fortress Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, which is west of Key West. And it is, by all accounts, a terrible place. One, OLaughlin, died of fever there, but the other 3 were released after only 4 years in prison, less than 4 years actually, by President Johnson right before he left office. There was a 10th conspirator, of course, and that was John Surratt Jr. He's sometimes referred to as, depending upon your point of view, either the man who got away or the man who let his mom take the fall for him. The big issue with Surratt, and he was not tried at this time with the other co-conspirators, was his location on the day of the assassination, April 14. He claimed he was in Elmira, New York. This is an image of the prison camp up there. There was a big Confederate holding camp for the Confederate prisoners of war. He said he was there casing the joint for a possible breakout. The federal prosecutors claimed that he had come back to New York, to Washington for the slaughter and was part of it. It became what we lawyers would call a swearing contest at the trial. The defense presented 5 witnesses that Surratt had been in Elmira. They were all tailors and haberdashers. I mentioned that Surratt was a bit of a clothes horse. They all testified that Surratt was wearing a certain style of Duke of Norfolk jacket that no one in Elmira had ever worn before or since. In response, the prosecution presented 13 witnesses who testified that Surratt was in Washington and they saw him there on April 14th. And they also presented all sorts of railroad timetables that showed he certainly could have gotten there. That was pretty unresolved, to be honest, but there was no dispute about his escape. As soon as the news gets out, as soon as there is an assassination, Surratt hightails it to Canada, where he's hidden by Catholic priests. The Surratts were a Catholic family. He sneaks onto a steamboat in a false identity. He's wearing a false mustache and glasses and dyed his hair. He then, when he gets to Britain, he is again hidden by priests, sneaks over to France and makes his way to Rome. And in Italy, he becomes a soldier for the Pope. This is Surratt in his papal zouave uniform. In this time, the zouave uniforms, which were based on North African soldiers, were just all the rage. We had northern and southern zouave units. The French had zouave units. The Pope had a zouave unit. They were just really cool uniforms with sashes and red, bright colors and baggy trousers and fezzes, and it just didn't look like anything else, so people liked them a lot. So he was a zouave, and he served there for a number of months until he was recognized by a fellow zouave who happened to also be from Baltimore. What are the odds? He then ratted him out to the American diplomats in Rome. The Americans got the zouaves to arrest him. Surratt had not lost his talent for evasion. He slipped out of custody either by leaping 23 feet to a small ledge or simply because somebody gave him the key to the cell. There are differing accounts. He slipped down in Naples, where he hid in the city jail, and then befriended a fellow who comes to us in history only as a British gentleman. This all feels like Day of the Jackal, 19th century version. And the British gentleman buys him a ticket to Egypt. And he boards a steamer to Alexandria, and he is finally arrested when he arrives in Alexandria, still in his zouave uniform. He is then brought back to face trial in the United States. He faces trial. I described the conflicting evidence about where he was. He then gets a hung jury. There's no verdict. He's ultimately set free. This is in 1867. He ends up working for a Baltimore shipping company and lives a quiet life until 1916 and dies in bed. So that's the history. And the question for me was, okay, I have this story arise in 1900. So what do I find in 1900 that I can tie to these events? Well, it turned out there was a fourth Booth brother. I didn't know. Joseph Booth. He was a doctor. Of course, he was in Baltimore. And he was still around. He never had been an actor. There was, however, a Booth descendant on the stage. Creston Clark was a nephew of John Wilkes Booth, son of John Wilkes's sister, Asia. The internet's a wonderful thing. I was able to find a review of a Creston Clark performance in King Lear in Denver. And the critic for the Denver Post said that Mr. Clark portrayed the king as though he were in constant apprehension that someone else was about to play the ace. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I don't think it's good. Also around was Louis Weichmann. Weichmann was the principal witness against the conspirators. He had lived in the Surratt house. He was a former schoolmate of John Surratt Jr. He had become something of a lunatic on the subject of the conspiracy. His life had really been he had been hounded through life by people who were angry about the fact that he gave testimony. And so people who were somewhat unhinged can be very interesting characters. Mrs. Grant was still around. It was always tricky photographing Mrs. Grant. She had a wayward eye, so you'll see that the photographer has followed his instructions there. So what else was going on in the world in 1900? Obviously, we had a presidential campaign. William McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt for the Republicans. This is Roosevelt's first time on a national ticket. And William Jennings Bryan for the Democrats. The country, and it's a little spooky, how things don't change much. We've got a foreign war, a counterinsurgency that we're fighting. After the Spanish-American War, we took the Philippines. There were Filipinos who thought that was a poor idea. They went into the jungles and started a resistance movement. We sent several thousand Marines to suppress them. Traffic was also a huge problem in Manhattan. We had two bridges had been built over the East River, Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge, but a third bridge was needed because the tie-ups were unbelievable. You couldn't believe the traffic. So this is the Williamsburg Bridge going up. So I felt like this yielded to me a very rich cast of characters for a story. They are the backdrop. I made up the two central characters. One, of course, and they're both inspired by history. One is the physician who hears the confession or the disclosure by Bingham on his deathbed. I thought he would be the person to become obsessed by it. So in the book, his name is James Fraser. And I thought he needed a partner. You know, Holmes and Watson and Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, they can talk to each other, they can get on each other's nerves. It's just more interesting than having one person. And your hero doesn't have to be a Superman. He doesn't have to be both smart and athletic. He can just be one. And I stumbled upon this fellow who inspired it. It's not based on him. I'm sorry, it's not him. I changed him, obviously. But this fellow was Moses Fleetwood Walker. He came from Steubenville, Ohio, which is just the next town over from Cadiz. And Fleet Walker, which was the name he went by, was the last black man to play in the professional baseball between the 1880s and Jackie Robinson. I had not known that when professional baseball first got started, it was integrated. And it took the white players a couple of decades to drive the blacks out, which they finally did. And Fleet Walker was the last guy to be driven out. He also had attended Oberlin College and the University of Michigan. And based on his experiences, it turned out he was an extremely angry fellow. And you have in your collection a screed by Moses Fleetwood Walker, about 65 pages long, that was published in 1907 or so. describing the misery of being a talented black person in America and saying that they have to go back to Africa in order to have a normal life. That is the only way you could have a normal life as a black person. I thought, boy, this would be an interesting guy to throw in with my white bread doctor from Cadiz. So he's been changed to a fellow named Speed Cook. But there are the overall, some of those key definitional points are still there. So then what's the secret? What's the conspiracy? Well, there have been lots of theories. First theory, of course, an early one, was that it was Andrew Johnson who did it, because who became president but Johnson? It's got some flaws as a theory, because actually they tried to kill Johnson. The rejoinder is, well, they sent this weak sister to try to kill him, Atzerodt, who'd be afraid of Atzerodt. And, you know, I think it's a whole, that's just really not persuasive. They did intend to kill Johnson, so that puts him in the clear for me. Jefferson Davis, of course. We put him in jail for 2 years waiting trial on this theory. Finally, because the case had sort of fallen apart, let him go, and we've managed to forget that the assumption was that he was behind it. Pope Pius IX. There was an active theory in the 1880s that the Pope was behind it, probably because the Surratts were Catholic. They were the only ones who were Catholic in the whole conspiracy. I'm not sure Pope Pius IX knew who Abraham Lincoln was. There is zero evidence, so that one is not a serious one. Then there was Otto Eisenschimmel or Himmelschimmel, that some fellow in the 1930s came up with this theory that Edwin Stanton was behind it, the Secretary of War. And that's why there's no evidence leading to him, because he ran the investigation and he destroyed all the evidence that would have led to him. It's one of those self-fulfilling theories. I end up rejecting this one, to be honest, on simply reasonableness grounds. Everything I know about Stanton was that he loved Lincoln, and he had, you know, nothing but the highest regard for him, and the notion that he arranged to kill Lincoln is just ridiculous. So, given those theories, I decided I'd just have to make one up. And I did, and it was tremendous fun. As I said, so much of history is silence. Even when you get into an event like this, you've had two-month trials on the subject. And we still have all these questions we can't answer about it. I couldn't possibly tell you what the secret was that I made up. My publisher would have my head. But I hope you find it at least somewhat plausible and entertaining. Thanks very much. I'd be happy to take any questions. Sir.
Haven't there been like very few conspiracies that have been proven throughout history?
The question is, haven't there been very few conspiracies as a group throughout history? That's a broad statement. Our presidential assassinations have not generally involved conspiracies. You know, Julius Caesar was pretty much a conspiracy. I think the Archduke Ferdinand was a conspiracy. There were conspiracies to kill Hitler that didn't work. We had Puerto Ricans who tried to kill Truman. So I think that's a little too broad. I think we probably have a mix of lone gunmen and conspiracies. The conspiracies tend to be more interesting to me. They tend to have a bit more, I don't know, political or emotional heft, because it's multiple people are agreeing that this must be done. But I'd be inclined to moderate that. Yes, ma'am.
What are you working on next that has you in all?
Well, I am working on, and I hope almost finished with, a nonfiction treatment of James Madison. And my examination of Madison is really focused on, my theme is that the essence of Madison, what made him distinct from many other leading politicians and figures, was his ability to work with other people. He tends to recede in history. He tends to not be noticed. He was small, he was bookish, he was quiet. But I think he had a gift for making partnerships, which allowed him to have an amazing reach. So the book is organized in 5 sections for 5 partnerships. His partnerships with Alexander Hamilton, Federalist Papers, the ratification of the Constitution, with Washington, setting up the government, the Bill of Rights, with Jefferson, founding political parties, creating our political system, thank you very much, with James Monroe, really the War of 1812, and of course with Dolly, where they sort of defined Republican social style. So it's been a lot of fun. And I've just sent in the manuscript. With any luck, I'm near the end, and then I have to write the sequel to this, because you discover when you write a mystery that the first response from a publisher who's interested in publishing it is, of course, this is the first of a series. And the answer is, yeah. So Jamie and Speed will be off on a fresh adventure. So. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear more about the difference between writing fiction and writing nonfiction, and moving from one to the other. Did it end up being easier than you expected, harder than you expected? Were there challenges that you wouldn't have anticipated?
The question is that what was it like going from nonfiction to fiction? And I have to disclose that before I wrote my history books, I actually tried to write novels. And I did write novels, and you can't buy them because they were never published. So I had some experience with doing it badly. And there are some obvious differences. Dialogue. You get to do dialogue, and it's actually a great treat. People speak, and they can interact, and you can have jokes, and it's sort of fun. The big problem is, where are you going? I have been fooled by great novelists who like to say, well, I just make up my characters and they tell me what my story is. If my characters know what the story is, they keep it to themselves. And I was able to deal with that here. You know, in a history book, you know where you're going. You know, Madison's going to die. I know the end. But in this case, and this was a recommendation from a novelist who I cross-examined on the subject, I did a really detailed outline, which I don't do for the history books because, you know, I sort of know where I'm going. But it was about 80 pages, and I didn't follow it slavishly. You know, when I was writing it, you know, there were times I needed to put in a new chapter. They had to do something else or had to depart. And, you know, there were parts of the outline that were really dialogue. I just sort of got into it and wrote that. But it helped me frame the thing. And that was the big change, and that was, I will certainly use that again. Yes, ma'am.
You said you invented the secret, but I'm curious whether you invented all the supporting evidence for your secret, or whether there is real history behind what your secret is.
Oh, you're good. The question was, since I invented the secret, did I invent all the supporting history behind it? Of course, I tried to make it fit the things we know. And so there are lots of factors, some I haven't talked about here. You know, and one I'll give you a small preview. There was a huge trade in, or illicit trade, smuggling of Confederate cotton. The Confederates desperately needed to sell it. The mills in New England needed it. They didn't have enough cotton. And it was a pretty corrupt deal. And it was one of the few things that General Grant and President Lincoln actually disagreed about. Grant thought it was insane that you would let your enemy ever make a dime. And Lincoln thought he had voters up in New England who needed to have jobs. And so we ought to let the cotton get sold. And he actually issued licenses to a couple of his wife's family to handle the cotton. So, yeah, I tried to use parts that we know to help build the story. In a couple of instances, I really had to make up stuff. You just need that. But I tried to fit it into a place where it's at least plausible. My inspiration is really, my last book was Aaron Burr, and the Burr-Hamilton duel is the thing we always focus on with Burr. That's what people know. And there's always this question about the duel, which is Hamilton had made a public statement that, he thought Burr was a crook and a fraud and all the things he always said about Burr. And then he said, and I have an opinion still more despicable about that man. And Burr was used to Hamilton calling him a crook and a liar, but despicable meant so sexually perverted. And Burr took offense to that. He wrote him, his initial letter highlights that term and says, I need an explanation for that, or you need to take it back. And we don't know what he meant. And Gore Vidal, in his novel, Burr, which is a great book, came up with the reason. And he said that what Hamilton was really saying was that Burr was sleeping with his daughter. And if you know the Burr story, Burr had only one child, one legitimate child, his daughter Theodosia. He thought the sun rose and set on her. He was totally devoted to her. And the suggestion that he was sleeping with his daughter would have made him crazy. And I thought, wow, that is a terrific explanation. And Vidal was very clear in interviews, I made this up, I have no evidence to base it. But it makes great sense. And so that was sort of my aspirational goal, was to come up with something that made sense. Yes, ma'am, maybe the last question.
When, after the conspirators were arrested and presumably the Surratt house was raided, were there records and things that they left behind that you were able to look at and that are here?
The question is, after the Surratt house was raided, was there physical evidence that they came up with? Not much. There was not much written down. Mary got into trouble because there was testimony that on the day of the assassination, she went out to the tavern and told them to dig up rifles and have them ready for two men who would come by that night, and then the two Booths came by that night and took the rifles. Well, that sort of put her in the soup. For the others, they had really Weichmann was the principal testimony. They did not have written testimony. The best analysis of this issue is in an absolutely impenetrable book by a fellow named Tidwell. It's called Come Retribution. He was a former CIA case officer, and he has two co-authors who tried to, I assume, help him express himself clearly and failed. It is a very difficult book to read. But he approached the whole conspiracy as an intelligence operation and did come up with some interesting evidence out of Confederate Secret Service files, which were not available at the time or were not looked at, which show the movements of, and are very suggestive. And I was influenced by Tidwell's work. So.
Well, thank you again.
Thanks very much.
Have to bring to a close.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.